And next up, we'll be joined by the ABS, very beloved social media channels. So this is exciting. We have Annalise Stitt and Xavier Stitsky talking about balancing privacy, accuracy, and ethical compliance in social media. I'll read the bios as they come up. Annalise joined the Australian Bureau of Statistics as part of the census team in 2021, helping to translate the data into meaningful stories. She worked closely with the media and social media section before officially joining the team in 2023. At the ABS, Annalise is part of the team responsible for content creation, monitoring, and metric analysis. She's passionate about looking for stories within the data and helping all Australians understand statistics can be relevant and fun. And Xavier works at the ABS, where he translates complex data sets into content that is readily accessible to the general public. He's passionate about harnessing data-driven insights to craft effective social media strategies and attain strategic objectives. Prior to joining the ABS, Xavier worked in private sector, focusing on social media, email marketing, and web development. So please give them a warm welcome. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Oh, perfect, thank you. So, hello everyone, I'm Xavier, this is Annalise. We're from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and today we're going to be talking about balancing privacy, accuracy, and ethical compliance in social media. So, every organisation, regardless of the industry it operates in, has a duty to protect the privacy of its users. At the ABS, for example, we have an obligation to protect the data that Australians provide to us through surveys and censuses. Now, we as the social media team are not necessarily bound by any legislation that prevents us from sharing this data on social media, though we do have an obligation to think about posts from a privacy and ethical standpoint. After all, when Australians complete our surveys, they don't necessarily envision their responses being shown on social media. So let's speak about why and how we protect the data of Australians. First of all, why? The first bit's obvious. We do it because it's morally right and because we have privacy legislations that we need to adhere to. But there's a deeper reason, and it's a more social media-centric reason. So the ABS has spent such a long time, decades, building this reputation as a trusted and credible provider of data. Now, for many Australians, our social media channels are the one touch point they have with our brand. So by posting a bit of content that's deemed to be inappropriate or invasive, it can result in Australians being less likely to complete our surveys and consequently resulting in Australia receiving less accurate data. Now, on the flip side, when we post content that's engaging, informative, and adheres to privacy, we're doing our part to increase survey participation and, in turn, make sure that Australia receives more accurate data. Now, let's speak about how. I've got these two examples on screen because they highlight what I'm going to talk about very well. So we, on occasion, post these map posts which look at the top suburbs in each state for people who fall into a specific variable. As you can see, I've highlighted examples where the top suburb has under 20 people. Now, at the ABS, there's a commonly used stats rule in which we will not reveal the true number when it's under 20, and that's to protect the privacy of those involved. It's because if we reveal the true number, let's imagine the true number is 4, it can result in people being identified or targeted. And I know what you're all thinking, Xavier, come on. The probability of being identified from a social media post is so low. I agree. In all honesty, you've probably got more likelihood of being struck by lightning, but we do have an obligation to make sure that it's impossible. I want to give you a very extreme example of what I'm trying to articulate. Let's imagine that we post a bit of content that's looking at the top suburbs in each state for people earning over $500,000 a year. And let's imagine that everyone here has hit the jackpot. You can all imagine your salary. I'm hoping that you're all imagining a number over 500,000. Let's imagine that you see your suburb on one of these posts and you see the number as 4, you and 3 other people. There's 2 ways to look at it. You might say, that's cool, me and 3 other people earn this amount, but more likely you'll look at it and say, this is a complete invasion of privacy. I trusted the ABS with this data and they've now misused it. So that's an ABS example of what an invasion of privacy could look like. Let's look more broadly. On the left, you'll see that Netflix posted a tweet in which they called out 53 people who'd watched A Christmas Prince every day for 18 days. Now, the jury's out on whether this is an actual invasion of privacy or not, but it was a perceived invasion of privacy because at the time, in 2017, it wasn't really as well known as it is now as to the level in which Netflix was surveying its users. So when this came out, people called it creepy, they called it invasive, some called it bullying, but that is besides the point. So that was more so a perceived invasion of privacy. On the right, this is a more objective example I've got. So show of hands, who here knows the fitness networking app Strava? There we are. So for anyone who doesn't, I'll explain it. It's just an app that tracks your physical activity. You can use it to run, walk, cycle, and you can track it to see where you go, how fast you go, etc. A few years ago, Strava released a heat map visualization similar to the one on the screen in which they showed every bit of information that had ever been collected on the app. It included over 3 trillion data points. Now, this was very interesting because you could zoom in as far as you wanted, a bit like Google Maps. The problem was that military analysts found that when you zoomed into a specific part of the Middle East, you're able to see jogging routes of US soldiers who were stationed in secret military bases. So I hope that I've highlighted the importance of data anonymization to protect privacy. But I do think it's even more important to highlight that anonymization comes at a cost, and that cost is privacy. So when we over-anonymize, we lose precision. And I'd like to give you an example, actually before this, of what I'm trying to articulate. Let's imagine that the ABS is looking to report on unemployment in a small town. Let's say that Town X has an unemployment rate of 4.5%. Now, very small town, so what we could do to protect privacy is round up to 5%, right? Sure, that protects privacy, but in doing so, the number is no longer accurate and we're now misleading people. We can get called out for this. So what we would do in this situation is instead of saying or revealing one true data point in a way that could be an invasion of privacy, we'd focus more so on the trend. So instead of saying unemployment in Town X is at 5%, we would say unemployment in very remote areas grew by 0.2% this quarter. I've got 2 examples on screen because they're what I'm going to refer to next. And it's another fantastic way to balance privacy and accuracy. It's through the use of grouping. As you can see, on the left-hand side of the screen, I've circled the 15 to 44 age group because it highlights what I'm trying to say very well. As you can see, 2% of Australians aged 15 to 44 have hypertension. Now, this is not an invasion of privacy because the 15 to 44 age group, as we know in Australia, is so broad. Even 2% of that age group is still an incredibly large number. But imagine if we were to post this by individual age group. The number of 19, 20, 21-year-olds with hypertension, it's a very small number. That would be an invasion of privacy. It's the same on the right with hours worked. There are a small number of people who work in highly competitive industries who work 120, 130 hours a week. But by saying 49 plus, we're able to protect the privacy of these people. Now, before I move on to the next part of my presentation, I think it's really important to note that while I've been speaking from the perspective of a stats agency, everything I've spoken about is transferable, and I think that everything I've spoken about is something that a lot of you will have used in your careers. Let me explain. So the need to balance privacy and accuracy is no different than when you're taking a positive bit of customer feedback and you're posting it online. It's no different to creating a case study when the client doesn't want to be identified. In each of these cases, you need to remove identifiers, but keep the numbers interesting and engaging enough for your audience. So I'd now like to speak about legality and ethics in social media. So, as some of you may know, the federal government recently introduced a bill in which they're looking to crack down on mis- and disinformation in social media. So the thresholds for mis and disinformation in this bill, in this proposed bill, are very high. But the fact that it's even being proposed highlights the growing need to be clear and concise on social media, especially nowadays when messages are fleeting, they're consumed so quickly. So, look, we're all humans in here. We're not robots. We're all influenced by our own biases, our own experiences, and our own thoughts. That's a given. But when we're working in social media, it's important that we're able to, in a sense, disassociate from that and write in a way or present content in a way that's more in accordance with our brand guidelines. I'd like to give you a fantastic example of what I'm trying to articulate. So the left-hand side of my screen, let's say that that is referring to the percentage of Australians who are victims of a crime in a 12-month period. I've made this up, so please do not go home and tell your friends that you've learnt something about Australian crime. But if we look on the top left-hand side, we can assume that about 3.9% of Australians were victims of a crime between 2008 and 2009. As we can see, there's a pretty steady downwards trend until about 2021, when we see a spike for 2 years, followed by an increase, but at a much slower rate. Now, a social media worker who's very optimistic and excited about the slowing rate of growth might say something like this: number of crime victims rose just 0.1% over the past year. I'm sure you can all see the problem with this. It's glorifying an increasing crime, which is obviously very bad, but the word just would be something that's against ABS guidelines, because it's in a sense trying to say that just is a word that is not objective. By saying this, it makes the reader think that the increase should have been more. By saying just, it downplays the importance of it. So, excuse me, hello? Yeah. So that's a very important example of how bias can influence the way we write. I'd like to take your attention to one more example on screen here. This is not fake. This is a real post that we put out earlier this year on the left-hand side of your screen. As you can see, we posted about ages at retirement by age group. We said that men retire later than women. As you can see, everything here is true. There's nothing wrong with it. Men tend to retire over 60 at a higher rate, and women tend to retire under 60 at a higher rate. Now, this post received a lot of backlash in the form of people arguing with each other. I'm sure you can all try to imagine the type of comments, but it was just men and women arguing about which gender actually works harder. How can we have mitigated this whole issue? With context. So the goal in social media is, especially for governments, is usually to maintain simplicity and make messages easy to read. But sometimes there are situations where added context can help to mitigate these potential backlashes. So by adding a bit of complexity to this post, we could have changed the whole course of it. We could have made sure that all of this negative commentary was avoided. And I'd like to finish off by really emphasising the point I'm trying to make on this slide, and that is that social media is a medium that naturally encourages very emotional engagement. So it's very important that we're able to stick to our brand guidelines, avoid letting our biases overcome us, and present content in a simple yet engaging way. I'd now like to pass to my colleague Annalise, who's going to talk about mis and disinformation in social media.
Thank you, Xavier. So, using the internet has never been easier, allowing us access to virtually unlimited information. Unfortunately, not all this information is accurate. The 2024 Digital News Report, conducted by the University of Canberra's News and Media Research Centre, found that Australians' reliance on social media as a source of news is growing. Also growing is our concern about misinformation, rising from 64% in 2022 to 75% this year. So what is mis and disinformation? The Australian Communications and Media Authority defines misinformation as false, misleading or deceptive information that can cause harm. And this can include things like fake news articles, doctored images or videos, false information that's shared by users on social media, and scam advertisements. While disinformation is defined as misinformation that is deliberately spread to cause confusion and undermine trust in governments or institutions. So on the next slide, I have a couple of examples, but I feel like the format that the slides are in might have a bit of a spoiler alert, so I will just tell you what they are. We have one post that says, Sunshine Coast man catches red belly black snake in a vacuum, and another post that says, city parking ranger accidentally gives himself a parking ticket and takes matter to court. Just unfortunately, we don't have any images or any background information for you, but just from what I've told you, raise your hand if you think option 1 might be misinformation. And raise your hand if you think option 2. Excellent. Option 2 is our misleading content. So let's take a look at how we can tell this might be misleading. And one way to break this down is to use the SIFT strategy. S stands for stop and think. This can be hard to do with how quickly social media is consumed these days, but take an extra moment to stop and consider what you've just seen and think, is it plausible? This has helped me out a number of times when articles from pages like The Chaser get mixed in between the Daily Oz and ABC News. I stands for investigate the source. This one's all about asking a lot of questions, so you might go a little bit crazy. So you want to think about how this information has come to you. Was it shared by a friend, a celebrity, your crazy alternative aunt who maybe shouldn't have Facebook? Who is the original poster? Is it a brand, a news outlet, a public figure? Is the source reputable and trustworthy? What's their agenda? Why are they posting it and why now? Finally, a good introspective question to ask, would you trust this person's expertise on this topic if they were saying something that you disagreed with? F stands for find other sources. Find other sources that you know and trust and see if they're saying the same thing. Can what you're reading be corroborated by any other trustworthy source? You can even use fact-checking websites and tools like RMIT Fact Lab, AAP Fact Check, and Google Fact Check. And finally, we have T, which stands for trace the content to its original context. This will probably come up in your earlier I and F investigations, but if you can find credible sources, the content still may have been taken out of context, which can be a key component in the spread of misinformation. So returning to our earlier example, we can break this down a little bit. Stop and think. Is it plausible that a parking inspector gave himself a ticket? It's possible, but it's unlikely. Investigate the source. This has come to us from the Batuta Advocate, which, if you're not familiar with, is a satirical news site. Find other sources. A quick Google will tell us that this story is not being widely reported. And trace the content to its original context. We know it's come from the Batuta Advocate site, and if you were to go onto any of their socials or the website itself, the articles that surround this one will pretty clearly tell you that this article is nothing more than satire. The reason that I chose this article as an example, aside from it being a bit of fun at the expense of parking inspectors, is to draw your attention to the fact that satire and parody can also be a form of misinformation. This article was actually picked up on and reported as news by one of Australia's morning shows. So it's really easy to see how when this is taken out of context, it can be spread as misinformation. So now we have a strategy to spot misinformation. How can we, as communication experts and content creators, try to combat this issue? Looking at some of the practices we employ at the ABS, I've broken this down into 3 categories: creating, educating, and monitoring. So starting with creating, any post that you're publishing or any media that you're putting out there, there's a chance that it can be misinterpreted. So when you're making content, you want to make sure that it is as clear and unambiguous as possible. That's why our number 1 tip is to use plain English. This is especially important if you're dealing with complex subject matter. For example, if we were to do a post about CPI, saying that it accounts for expenditure by households, I've used an acronym that everyone's probably not familiar with if you're not into finance. And I haven't explained what my message is in language that's familiar with a general social media audience. So instead, I could say something like the Consumer Price Index, brackets CPI, accounts for what households are spending. It's also important to think about how your content will be read by someone that has no other context or background information. This can be hard to do when you know your message extremely well, so try to find someone from another team or another area in your organisation and ask them how they interpret the post. We have an example up here on the slide of some tiles that we were looking at for International Beer Day. And while both of these tiles are technically correct, the slide with the line graph on the right, we felt was a little misleading because of its use of two axes. So if you're just to look at the lines on this graph, it would appear as though non-alcoholic beer exports have overtaken that, or imports, sorry, have overtaken that of alcoholic beer imports, which is not the case. So if you're quickly scrolling through, or even if you're not as familiar with this type of graph, it's clear to see how this could be quickly misinterpreted, which is why we shifted to a slope graph, which is our other example up there. Sorry. Another thing to consider when you're creating your posts is to not write your content to fit a certain narrative. So taking Xavier's earlier example of the crime statistics, if you were a politician or a real estate agent and you wanted to share a message that crime in a certain area was no big deal, you might take that last data point saying that crime rose just 0.1% in a certain area. However, knowing the earlier data points show a steeper rise in crime rates, it would be misleading for them to exclude that and only select the data that supports their message. And finally, be transparent. Clearly showing where you've sourced your information helps to build brand credibility. As discussed earlier, people are wary of misinformation on social media and they're looking for credible sources. The easier you can make it for them to find the source and find the content in its original context, the better. Being transparent also means owning up to mistakes. If you're willing to admit to and correct an error, this can improve relationships with your audience and build users' trust in your content. And this feeds nicely into educating our audience. When we're setting our targets at the beginning of each year, we include a set number of posts that are designed to help educate our audience. Sometimes this is about our different tools which users can use to find their own data and fact check for themselves. Other times we're teaching them about certain statistical concepts. This can be as simple as the difference between mean and median to try and encourage critical thinking about which measure is best. Sometimes we even post about concepts specifically to do with our releases. Something like the gender pay gap I feel is often reported on in news articles, but did you know there are actually 6 different ways we measure the gender pay gap? By educating our audience about these different measures, we hope that when they're consuming media, they're questioning why a particular measure has been chosen. Finally, we have monitoring and moderating. This takes us back a bit to being able to spot misinformation. You want to closely monitor what you've posted. If you've established yourself as a credible source of information and you have other users commenting or using your information to spread mis and disinformation, this is something you want to correct pretty quickly. I have an example up here on a slide of an Instagram page that credited the ABS as the source for the top 10 baby names in Australia for 2023. This is not data that the ABS collects, and having us credited as the source could bring up concerns among users regarding their privacy. Luckily, we were able to contact this user and get them to remove us as the source. However, I later saw that they credited the New South Wales government as the source, which I feel is incorrect also. So while it's obviously not possible to correct all misinformation that is spread about your organisation or your topic, try and correct the instances you feel will have a significant impact. Some of the ways you can do this are to use the in-platform features of reporting when you see misinformation. In some cases like this, you can ask to take them down. And in other cases, you might even have to post your own content, which explains and corrects the topic that the misinformation is about. And just before we finish up, I'd like to touch quickly on cyberbullying and harassment, as this is also one of the foremost challenges facing social media users today. We want people to engage with our posts, but we want them to do so in an appropriate and respectful way. So we have a clear set of guidelines which we can refer to when we encounter instances of cyberbullying and harassment. This is to use in-platform features and hiding and reporting, even blocking users if they're repeat offenders. And we also have sometimes responses prepared for questions or statements we know are likely to come up regarding a certain topic. And this allows us to respond quickly and minimise any disagreements or arguments that might come up in the comments. These kind of interactions can be hard on users, but also on the moderators. So it's important to also make sure you're taking care of your team. At the ABS, we have a few practices in place for this, such as having a few people responsible for monitoring and moderating. Sorry, that's hard to say so close together. So it's not all on one person. We also have the option to debrief with our supervisor or the Employee Assistance Program, and we'll share links and phone numbers to resources such as Beyond Blue or Lifeline that both users and monitors can use if needed. So as long as social media keeps evolving, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to these issues. But by continuing to share strategies such as those that we've mentioned today and educating ourselves and others, we can help make the social media environment a better place for everyone. Thanks.
Hi guys, thank you. My name's Liz. I'm from the New South Wales Department of Education. I'm interested in your monitoring systems. You mentioned that example there of the neon signs and the top baby names. I can imagine there are things that come up every day for you guys. So what does that system look like for ABS?
In terms of tools, we use Nuvi or Reputation, and we'll have a roster, so everyone has 1 or 2 days, depending on how many people are available in the team, and that will go through the listening reports, so that will pull in all mentions of Australian Bureau of Statistics, census, a whole bunch of keywords. As you can imagine, just ABS or ABS is very problematic. And they'll also be responsible for replying to or researching any comments. So sometimes that can be as simple as liking someone's comment if they've made, you know, a nice suggestion or something, as well as people asking more in-depth questions, which we'll then have to go and research and come back to find that a user has answered for us, which is also nice. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Tara from Public Record Office, Victoria. And I guess I was interested in your perspective and what your guidelines are in terms of deciding when to hide a comment versus when to block someone. So I know, you know, years ago when I first started in social media, it was, you never wanted to block anyone, or that was sort of what you're always told is just hide the comment and then no one else can see it. But I know for us, it's gotten to the point where it's the same people posting things that they shouldn't be. And so it gets to a point where you're just like, I'm blocking. Like, you know, I've seen 3 from this person in the last week, I'm blocking. So I'm wondering if you've got like a scale like that or how you make that decision.
Yeah, great question. Generally, we employ sort of like the 3-strike rule, where we will hide their comments that go against our guidelines and are very distasteful. And then if they come back and they do it again, sometimes we'll send them a warning being like, hey, you're breaching our guidelines. Just so you're aware, if you do it again, we will block you. And then if they do it again, of course, we do block them. Sometimes if they're really extreme and our judgment is that they're not going to respond well to being warned, we will just block them. But thankfully, it doesn't happen often.
Questions?
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I'm Jazz from Donate Life. I found it really interesting when you were talking about making sure that you're protecting people's privacy. Obviously, it's so important. I was wondering if you could speak to how you go about sharing data when you've got such a small pool. So, for example, with organ donation, there's only maybe like 500 donors a year, and obviously you want to be making sure that like we protect their privacy. How do you go about sharing that important data, but also be really careful about it?
Well, a lot of the time we get advice from the subject matter areas. So we're obviously, us as the communications team, have a rudimentary understanding of statistics, and whereas the people who actually collect the statistics and do the methodology, they have a much better understanding. So we'll let them make the judgment call as to whether it's appropriate or not to post. But yeah, as I say, the rule of 20 is one that we use quite often, but that's more so for geographical purposes. There are times when we will post, we'll say 19 people in Australia fall into this variable for a very specific type of post if it's a special day. But yeah, I know that's not quite the answer you're expecting or hoping for, but it usually depends on the subject matter areas, so we just defer to their judgment.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lucy from the City of Perth. I'm just wondering what motivates you to make some of the decisions around like highlighting the Scottish people that live in this region or whatever. Like, how are you planning your content or picking things to highlight that day or that week?
Usually we have two types of posts that we do. We post obviously when new data is released, and then we also have a day of special days in which we'll look to celebrate something. So, for example, with a Scotland map, we'll post on Scotland Day, or if there's a day for ice cream or any type of food or wine or something, we'll find data that relates to that. And yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just interested, how far do you forward plan with that kind of stuff? Just on top of that. No, that did answer my question.
No, we do it at the start of the year. So at the start of the year, we collect or we find as many days as possible that are appropriate and that our audience will like. And yeah, we'll go from there and plan in advance. We usually start making the content, depending on the size of the post, anywhere from a month to 2 weeks before.
Just to build on that question as well, what do your approval processes look like?
Oh, yes.
So once you've set up your plan, where does that go there?
Yes, great question. So we have a few approval processes. First of all, we send a month ahead to our program director, so the director of media and social media, and she'll say this is good. She'll usually be fine with all of them, but sometimes this one's not appropriate. And then for individual posts, we just go to the subject matter areas. So, for example, if we're doing a post on inflation, we go to the inflation area, or if it's one of the maps, we'll go to one of the demography areas. And yeah, so it's two approval processes: one for our team leader, and then one with the subject matter area for that content.
Big fan of your channels. I'm Courtney from CFA. I was just wanting to find out as well, with those community days that you choose to celebrate, it's something that we try and do a lot of as well, but we tend to get a lot of negative backlash whenever we celebrate any particular community. How, I guess, managing those conversations, but do you ever make any decisions around like closing comments or like kind of back on that moderation piece, but what's the engagement like as well on them? 2 points to that question. So engagement, but then also like, do you ever choose to like stop comments on anything, or have you ever had to get to that point?
Yeah, great questions. That is very appropriate considering we just brought up the Scotland map. It is a bit of more of a tame sort of area than if we were to do, say, an Asian country. We've had a few instances where we have received a lot of negative commentary surrounding that. I think we even got a question this morning on our Scotland post sarcastically requesting a map for an area, which we have hidden. So it's mostly hiding comments, but there have been instances where we have posted it sort of if there's a public holiday coming up, or if it's about to be a weekend. Sometimes we will close off the comments for that just because no one is monitoring and we don't want to take that risk that it could escalate.
I'm sorry, just a follow-up. Do you state on the posts that you're closing the comments? We've actually just had this question from our senior exec about why don't we just shut comments off? I'm like, well, it kind of goes against like social media, but yeah. I'm really curious about how you manage it.
Yeah, so it is sort of a bit of a like take it case by case, I suppose, because each sort of instance can be different. We tend to have turning comments off as a last resort because we do want to have that option for everyone to share their opinion, even if their opinion is wrong. But we do obviously want to encourage engagement with our posts, and we don't want to cut off that genuine good engagement that we are getting from those communities saying, I can't believe you referenced our suburb, tagging their friends, tagging you know, the Slovakian Cultural Club from Bendigo, like something super random but really, really cute. So we try to make that our very last resort, and we're actually working through sort of at the moment timeframes on if we do turn them off, do we turn them back on? If so, after how long? And I think that will be a bit platform specific as well. Obviously, stuff on Twitter, you'll want to keep off for a bit longer than something on LinkedIn.
Hi, Virginia here from CSIRO Publishing. Big fans of your work. I just wanted to know if you're planning so far in advance, and I think it's really interesting that you actually plan at the start of the year those kinds of cultural days, or Edgar Allan Poe Day, etc. Do you have room in your schedule for things that kind of come up and are more topical? Like, do you find your content needs to also be flexible like that, and how do you manage that?
Yeah, for sure. So to build on what Xavier was saying earlier, the month ahead that we send doesn't have content in it. It has a specific day or something that, like, a release will come out. So I think CPI came out today, so that will be in the month ahead calendar along with St Andrew's Day. And so that's just a general idea of what's coming out, and we're not specifically like stuck to that schedule. And so, of course, like, we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about what we have been watching, that Secret Lives of Mormon Wives show. And so we looked up how many Mormons there are in Australia, that sort of thing. We did a post for Pesto, the Penguin, which we're big fans of, and we're really sad we won't get time to see. So in our Monday morning meetings, we do have, has anyone seen any trends? Is there anything that you think is funny? Or if you've found a specific bit of data that you think would make a really good story, then we have that flexibility to work that in. And the great thing about those posts, especially if it's data first, then story, is that they're generally not tied to a specific day. So we have 4 releases, I think, coming out on the 8th of November. And it's also Cappuccino Day, and it's just, there's a lot going on that day. So we're trying to see what other days we can post on, rather than sort of blocking out that one day for so many different things. So it's really good when it's not tied to a specific day and it's a bit quieter, you have something to post.
Hi, Hayden from Home Affairs. You spoke about adapting some of that data, like, visually, I think with the 2 line graphs. What agency do you guys have to make those calls or make those changes, or does that sit with the data experts, or do you, like, where does that kind of relationship lie? Do you provide that guidance from, like, a social media perspective? Just keen to hear how that looks.
Yeah, so we're really lucky in that a lot of the subject matter areas at the ABS understand that we are the communications experts, and they give us that agency to take the data and present it in a way that we know will the social media audience will love, or we hope at least. So a lot of the time we do have that flexibility, guided by the basic principles of, you know, line graphs show trends over time. So you want to do something with that. Or, you know, comparisons of Pesto and a 5 to 7-year-old child is fine to just have icons, that sort of thing. So we do have the agency to make that call ourselves. The only time when we are more aware of it is when the data pertains to quite a serious matter. So I'm not sure if everyone's heard of Mindframe. They've got some really good guidelines when talking about mental health and suicide and that sort of thing. So in those instances, when we are posting about that data, we'll follow their guidelines on how to best represent that, so as not to offend or, you know, trigger anyone.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.